When Elara found the injured girl hiding in her wheat fields, she thought she was saving a life. She had no idea that by dawn her father would arrive with an entire battalion, demanding her return at gunpoint. Elara Blackwood, 42, tens. Her 300-acre farm in the windswept highlands of Thornwick Valley, like a woman trying to rebuild a shattered world one furrow at a time. The morning light catches the silver streaks in her dark hair as she moves through endless rows of golden wheat, her movements precise but heavy with the weight of memories she cannot escape. 3 years ago, her daughter Lydia died in a military operation overseas, a brilliant young lieutenant who'd followed her family's tradition of service. Despite her mother's growing fears about the endless conflicts consuming their nation of Astoria. Since that devastating knock on her door from uniformed officers, Elara has transformed her once thriving family farm into a fortress of solitude. The stone farmhouse that once bustled with 3 generations of Blackwood women now echoes with hollow silence. Lydia's military commendation sits in a drawer, unopened. Her bedroom remains exactly as she left it during her last leave. Tactical gear neatly arranged, maps of foreign territories pinned to walls. A half-finished letter to her mother still sitting on the desk. Elara can't bring herself to enter that room, but she can't bring herself to change it either. The kitchen table, once the heart of animated family discussions about crops, weather, and dreams, now accommodates only one setting. Elara eats her meals in mechanical silence, the grandfather clock in the corner marking time that feels suspended. She stopped cooking the elaborate meals that once brought neighbors together during harvest time. Now, she survives on simple fair bread, cheese, whatever vegetables she can manage from her neglected garden. The people of Thornwick Valley whisper about Elara Blackwood's transformation. Once, she'd been the backbone of their farming community, organizing harvest festivals, leading the women's cooperative, opening her home to anyone in need. Her grandmother, Old Mother Sage, had been the unofficial healer for 3 townships. Her mother, Helena, had served as the valley's unofficial mediator for disputes. The Blackwood women had always been the ones others turned to in times of trouble. Now Elara barely acknowledges her neighbors. When farmer Tobias Greenfield's barn burned down, she sent money anonymously but refused to join the rebuilding effort. When the Autumn Harvest Festival Committee came calling, she met them at her gate and politely but firmly declined to participate. The woman who once opened her doors to every celebration now locks them against the world. Her transformation runs deeper than grief, it's rooted in rage. Rage at a government that sends children to fight wars with no clear purpose. Rage at a military system that turned her brilliant, compassionate daughter into a soldier. Rage at herself for not fighting harder against Lydia's decision to enlist. The Blackwood family had served in Astoria's military for 5 generations. But Elara had hoped that tradition would die with her. She'd tried to convince Lydia to become a doctor instead, to use her intelligence for healing rather than warfare. But Lydia had inherited the Blackwood sense of duty, insisting that someone had to protect their homeland from the growing threats along Astoria's borders. Their last conversation before deployment had been an argument. Elara, begging her daughter to request a transfer to non-combat duties. Lydia firmly explaining that she couldn't ask others to take risks she wouldn't take herself. The irony of her current situation would have made Lydia laugh. Elara, who'd grown to despise everything connected to Astoria's military machine, now finds herself living like a soldier, disciplined, isolated, focused solely on survival rather than living. She rises before dawn, tends her crops with military precision, and goes to bed exhausted enough that sleep comes without dreams. The farm itself reflects her inner state. What was once a showcase of sustainable agriculture has become purely functional. The flower gardens that Helena had lovingly maintained have grown wild. The fruit orchards that provided abundance for the entire valley now drop their harvest unharvested. Elara grows only what she needs: wheat, basic vegetables, enough to sustain one person living a deliberately diminished life. Her neighbors in Thornwick Valley have tried to help. Dr. Calloway, the valley's physician, stops by monthly under the pretense of checking on her health. Pastor Benedict from the Old Stone Church brings her preserves his congregation has made. Even crusty old Wilhelm Steinhardt, who farms the adjacent property and rarely speaks to anyone, has taken to leaving fresh bread on her doorstep. But Elara accepts their kindness with polite distance. She pays for what she needs, accepts nothing that feels like charity, and makes it clear through her demeanor that she prefers to be left alone. The people of Thornwick Valley respect her grief, but they also remember the woman she used to be, the one who would never have turned away from someone in need. The seasons have changed around her without her noticing. Spring planting, summer growth, autumn harvest, they've become mechanical processes rather than celebrations of the earth's cycles. She no longer reads the poetry that once inspired her understanding of farming as an art form. She doesn't listen to the folk songs that used to accompany her work. The radio in her kitchen stays tuned to weather reports and market prices. Nothing more. Her hands, once soft despite her farm work, have grown calloused and scarred. Her body has become leaner, harder, carved by physical labor and insufficient attention to her own needs. She looks older than her 42 years, her face marked by too much sun and too little joy. The laugh lines around her eyes have deepened into something that speaks more of squinting against harsh light than of happiness. The farmhouse creaks around her at night, settling into shapes that sometimes sound like footsteps or voices. She's learned to ignore these auditory ghosts, but they serve as constant reminders that this house was built for a family. It's not for one woman carrying the weight of generations. The Blackwood family cemetery sits on a hill overlooking the farmhouse. 5 generations of strong women who'd lived full lives, and now Lydia, whose life ended far too soon. Elara visits the cemetery every evening at sunset, not to grieve, but to report on the day's work. She tells her grandmother about soil conditions, her mother about weather patterns, and Lydia about anything except the loneliness. These one-sided conversations have become her only outlet for the thoughts that accumulate during long days of silence. She's unaware that her isolation has become its own kind of reputation in Thornwick Valley. People speak of Elara Blackwood the way they might speak of a natural landmark, permanent. It's unchanging, essential to the landscape, but not quite part of the living community. Children dare each other to walk past her gate. Traveling merchants ask locals about the hermit woman with the beautiful farm. But what they don't understand is that Elara's withdrawal isn't permanent, it's protective. She's not hiding from the world. She's preventing herself from caring about it again. Learn that caring leads to loss, that opening your heart means accepting the possibility of having it shattered. The military took her daughter, and by extension, it took her faith in the institutions and traditions that had once given her life meaning. The final layer of her transformation involves her relationship with the land itself. The Blackwood farm sits on some of the most fertile soil in Thornwick Valley, blessed with natural springs and protected from harsh winds by surrounding hills. For generations, it had been more than a business, it had been a calling, a partnership with the earth that provided not just sustenance but purpose. Now, Elara farms as if she's fulfilling a contract rather than following a passion. She plants what will grow with minimal input, harvests what she needs to survive, and lets the rest follow natural cycles without human intervention. The land produces enough to keep her comfortable, but it no longer sings the songs of abundance that once made the Blackwood farm legendary throughout the region. She tells herself that this diminished existence is enough, that solitude is safer than community, that routine is more reliable than hope. She's built a life that can't surprise her with loss, because she's already lost everything that mattered. The farm provides exactly what she asks of it, nothing more, nothing less. But on this particular autumn evening, as golden light stretches across her wheat fields and the first hint of winter touches the mountain air, Elara Blackwood has no idea that her carefully constructed world of isolation is about to be shattered by a discovery that will force her to choose between the safety of solitude and the dangerous possibility of caring about someone again. The irony that would soon unfold, that the very thing she'd grown to hate most in this world would arrive at her farm demanding something she wasn't prepared to give up, would either destroy the last remnants of the woman she used to be or restore them in ways she never thought possible. The morning of October 15th arrived with an unusual restlessness that seemed to permeate every corner of Thornwick Valley. Elara Blackwood woke before dawn, as she had every day for the past 3 years. But something felt different about the quality of silence that surrounded her farmhouse. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, heavy with the promise of change that she couldn't yet identify. She moved through her morning routine with the same mechanical precision that had governed her days since Lydia's death. Strong, consumed standing at the kitchen counter, while staring out at fields that stretched endlessly toward the mountain range that bordered their valley. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked its steady rhythm, marking seconds that felt somehow more significant today, though Elara couldn't explain why. The weather reports on her radio spoke of an unusual atmospheric pressure system moving in from the northern mountains, the kind that often preceded significant storms. But the meteorologists seemed uncertain about the timeline and intensity. Unpredictable conditions, they kept saying, unlike anything we've seen in this region before. Elara switched off the radio with more force than necessary. She had no patience for uncertainty, having learned to distrust anything that couldn't be controlled or predicted. As she pulled on her work boots and heavy jacket, preparing for another day of solitary labor, Elara noticed her hands trembling slightly. She attributed it to the morning chill, but deep down, some primitive part of her consciousness recognized the tremor as something else. Entirely the body's response to danger it couldn't yet comprehend. The early morning air outside carried an electric quality that made the hair on her arms stand up. The usual symphony of dawn sounds, birds greeting the sunrise, insects humming in the grass, the distant lowing of cattle on neighboring farms, seemed muted, as if nature itself was listening for something that hadn't yet arrived. Lyra's first task was always checking the perimeter of her property, a habit she'd developed partly for practical farming reasons and partly because the routine gave structure to days that might otherwise stretch endlessly. She walked the familiar path along her fence line, noting automatically which posts needed repair and where the wire had been stressed by weather or wildlife. It was during this morning inspection that she first noticed the unusual activity on the mountain roads. Thin streams of dust rose in the distance, barely visible against the gray sky, but unmistakably present. Vehicle traffic, and more of it than Thornwick Valley typically saw. The isolated nature of their region meant that strangers were rare, and large groups of vehicles even rarer. For a moment, a chill ran through her that had nothing to do with the morning temperature. Military convoys had passed through the valley before, usually en route to training exercises in the more remote mountain regions. The sight of military vehicles always triggered a complex web of emotions in Elara. Anger and a protective instinct that made her want to lock her doors and close her curtains until they passed. But these distant dust clouds seemed different, somehow more persistent, more purposeful, as if whatever was creating them wasn't just passing through, but was actively searching for something, or someone. Elara shook her head, annoyed with herself for allowing paranoid thoughts to intrude on her carefully structured day. Thornwick Valley was hundreds of miles from any active conflict zones. There was no reason for military forces to be interested in their remote farming community. She forced herself to focus on the immediate tasks at hand, checking the irrigation system, inspecting the wheat for signs of disease or pest damage, maintaining the equipment that kept her operation running. The work provided its usual numbing comfort. The repetitive nature of farming tasks allowing her mind to drift into the blank state she'd perfected over the past 3 years. Physical labor had become her meditation, her escape from thoughts that led inevitably back to loss and regret. As long as her hands were busy and her body was moving, she could exist in a present tense that didn't require her to confront the painful complexities of memory or hope. But today, even the familiar routines couldn't completely quiet the growing sense of unease that seemed to emanate from the very air around her. The atmospheric pressure continued to drop, creating a kind of oppressive feeling that often preceded severe storms. Yet the sky remained an ambiguous gray, neither clearing nor darkening into obvious threat. Around midday, as Elara was replacing a damaged section of irrigation pipe near the eastern edge of her property, she heard the distant rumble of heavy engines carried on the wind. The sound was too sustained and too deep to be normal traffic. It spoke of large vehicles, multiple vehicles, moving with purpose through terrain that wasn't designed for easy passage. She straightened slowly, her back protesting after hours of bent-over work, and listened carefully. The sound seemed to be coming from multiple directions, as if whatever convoy was out there had split into separate groups. The tactical implications of such a maneuver weren't lost on her. She'd listened to enough of Lydia's military briefings to recognize the basics of strategic positioning. A new kind of fear began to crystallize in her chest. Not the generalized anxiety she'd been feeling all morning, but something more specific and immediate. Military forces didn't typically spread out in multiple directions unless they were either conducting a large-scale training exercise or searching for something important enough to warrant significant resources. Elara abandoned her irrigation work and walked quickly back toward the farmhouse, her boots crunching on the frost-covered ground. From the higher elevation of her front porch, she had a better view of the surrounding valley and the network of roads that connected the scattered farming communities. What she saw made her blood run cold. Dust clouds were rising from at least 4 different directions, all seemingly converging on the general area where her farm and several neighboring properties were located. The vehicles creating those dust clouds were still too distant to identify clearly, but their movement patterns suggested coordination and purpose that went far beyond routine patrol or transportation duties. For the first time in 3 years, Elara found herself wishing she had maintained closer relationships with her neighbors. Dr. Calloway might have heard something through his connections at the regional medical center. Pastor Benedict often received information about community events or concerns through his network of other religious leaders. Even Wilhelm Steinhardt, with his suspicious nature and tendency to monitor radio frequencies, might have picked up intelligence about whatever was happening. But she had deliberately isolated herself from those sources of information, preferring the illusion of safety that came with ignorance. Now, faced with circumstances that felt increasingly threatening, she realized how thoroughly she had cut herself off from the world beyond her farm boundaries. The rational part of her mind tried to construct innocent explanations for what she was observing. Military training exercises were common enough in the mountain regions. Search and rescue operations occasionally required significant coordination of resources. There could be any number of legitimate reasons for increased military activity that had nothing to do with her or her property. But the primitive, survival-oriented part of her consciousness wasn't buying the rational explanations. That part of her mind recognized the signs of a carefully orchestrated operation designed to surround and contain rather than simply pass through. The timing, the multiple approach routes, the sustained nature of the vehicle movement, it all pointed to something far more deliberate and focused than routine military business. As the afternoon wore on, the sense of approaching storm intensified both literally and metaphorically. The atmospheric pressure continued to drop, creating an almost physical weight that seemed to press down on the valley. Dark clouds began to gather along the mountain peaks, though they moved with an unusual sluggishness that suggested the weather system was as confused and unpredictable as everything else about this day. Elara found herself unable to concentrate on normal farming tasks. Instead, she moved restlessly around her property, checking and rechecking security measures she hadn't thought about in years. She tested the locks on her outbuildings, inventoried her emergency supplies, and even retrieved the shotgun her father had taught her to use decades ago. The weapon felt strange and heavy in her hands, a reminder of skills she'd hoped never to need again. Lydia had tried to teach her more advanced defensive techniques during her military training, but Elara had resisted, preferring to believe that their remote location and peaceful community made such knowledge unnecessary. Now, as she checked the shotgun's mechanism and counted her limited supply of ammunition, she wished she had paid more attention to her daughter's lessons. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was preparing to defend herself using knowledge that came from the same military culture she'd grown to despise. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, casting long shadows across her wheat fields, Elara made a decision that went against every instinct she'd developed over the past 3 years. She was going to leave her property and attempt to gather information about what was happening in the wider valley. The decision terrified her almost as much as the approaching unknown threat. Leaving the farm meant abandoning the controlled environment she'd created, the predictable routines that had kept her functional since Lydia's death. It meant potentially encountering other people, engaging in conversations that might require her to care about outcomes beyond her own immediate survival. But the alternative, remaining ignorant and isolated while potentially dangerous forces gathered around her, seemed even worse. Whatever was coming, She needed to understand it well enough to make informed decisions about how to respond. Loaded the shotgun and secured it in her truck. Along with basic supplies and the small amount of cash she kept for emergencies, as she prepared to leave, she found herself taking one last look around the farmhouse that had been both sanctuary and prison for the past 3 years. Lydia's bedroom door remained closed, as it had since the day the military officers delivered their devastating news. The kitchen table still held only one place setting. The grandfather clock continued its steady marking of time that felt suspended between past and future. Everything was exactly as she'd left it that morning, yet somehow, it all felt different, more fragile, more precious, more likely to be lost. For the first time in years, Elara allowed herself to acknowledge how much she loved this place, not just as a refuge, but as a home. The realization came with a sharp pang of fear. Having something to lose again meant having something to fight for, and fighting required the kind of engagement with the world that she'd been avoiding. As she drove down the long gravel driveway that connected her farm to the main valley road, Elara caught sight of movement in her rearview mirror. Something large and dark had emerged from the tree line at the far edge of her property, too distant to identify clearly, but unmistakably present. Her hands tightened on the steering wheel as she reached the main road and turned toward town. Behind her, more movement flickered at the edges of her vision. Vehicles, she was certain now, positioning themselves around the perimeter of her land. The gathering storm had arrived, and she was no longer safe in the isolated sanctuary she'd created. Whatever forces were converging on Thornwick Valley, they were specifically interested in her property, her farm, her carefully constructed world of solitude. As she drove toward the village center, hoping to find answers, or at least allies, Elara Blackwood had no idea that she was driving away from a discovery that would change everything she thought she knew about courage, sacrifice, and the true meaning of protection. Behind her, hidden in the wheat fields she'd tended with such mechanical precision, a young woman lay unconscious and bleeding, carrying secrets that would bring the full force of military power to bear on one isolated farm. The storm clouds gathered overhead, the mountain roads filled with the rumble of approaching engines, and the stage was set for a confrontation that would test everything Elara believed about the value of isolation versus the dangers of caring about someone other than herself. By tomorrow morning, the woman who had sworn never to open her heart again would be forced to choose between the safety of distance and the terrifying possibility of love, a choice that would determine not just her own fate, but the fate of someone young enough to be the daughter she'd lost, someone whose very presence would challenge every wall she'd built around her wounded soul. The village center of Thornwick Valley consisted of little more than a cluster of weathered buildings, ranged around a small square where a bronze statue of some forgotten military hero stood watch over the daily routines of fewer than 300 residents. As Elara's truck rumbled to a stop outside Hendrick's General Store, she could immediately sense that the unusual tension she'd been feeling wasn't limited to her own property. Small groups of people stood in doorways and on street corners, their conversations hushed but animated. The body language was unmistakable, heads leaning together, frequent glances toward the surrounding hills, hands gesturing in directions that corresponded to the dust clouds she'd observed earlier. Whatever was happening, the entire community was aware of it and clearly concerned. Elara sat in her truck for a long moment, gathering the courage to engage with people she'd been avoiding for 3 years. The prospect of walking into Hendrick's store, where she'd inevitably encounter neighbors who would want to ask questions about her well-being and her plans, felt almost as daunting as the military presence gathering around her farm. But the need for information overrode her social anxiety. She climbed out of the truck, pulled her jacket tighter against the increasingly cold wind, and walked toward the store with as much confidence as she could muster. The bell above the door chimed as she entered, and the conversation among the half-dozen people gathered near the counter stopped abruptly. Elara felt the weight of their stares, the mixture of surprise and concern that came with seeing someone who'd become almost mythical in their small community. Old Henrik Hendrick, the store's owner and unofficial keeper of valley gossip, recovered first. "Elara Blackwood," he said, his voice carrying equal parts warmth and caution. "Haven't seen you in here for Must be 6 months now. Hello, Henrik? Elara's voice sounded rusty to her own ears. The social muscles she'd allowed to atrophy over the past 3 years, struggling to function. I was hoping you might have heard something about the increased military activity in the area. The question broke whatever spell her presence had cast over the room. Suddenly, everyone was talking at once, their voices overlapping in a rush of shared concern and speculation. Started seeing the convoys around dawn, said Martha Caldwell, the village school teacher. My classroom faces the north road, and I've counted at least 30 vehicles so far. More than 30, corrected Jacob Thorne, Henrik's nephew who worked part-time at the store. I was up early checking on sick cattle and saw them moving through the pass before sunrise. Big trucks, armored vehicles, the kind you see in news. Footage from war zones. Dr. Calloway, who'd been standing quietly near the medical supplies section, stepped forward. I received a call from the regional medical center this morning. They've been told to prepare for potential casualties, but no one would give specifics about what kind of operation is being conducted. The information hit Elara like a physical blow. Preparations for casualties meant this wasn't a routine training, exercise, or a simple search operation. Someone expected violence, expected people to be hurt. The protective instincts she'd tried so hard to suppress over the past 3 years roared back to life with startling intensity. Did anyone mention why they're here? She asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. What they're looking for? Pastor Benedict, who'd been listening from his position near the door, cleared his throat. My contact at the regional military chaplain's office mentioned something about a high-value recovery operation. Someone important has gone missing. Someone whose disappearance has national security implications. The pieces began falling into place in Elara's mind with horrifying clarity. A high-value target. Military forces converging from multiple directions. Preparation for casualties. And all of it focused on the area around her farm. The isolated property where someone could hide undetected for days or weeks. How long do they expect this operation to last? She asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. Dr. Calloway shook his head grimly. That's the thing nobody seems to know. The medical center was told to prepare for an indefinite deployment. Could be days, could be weeks. They're bringing in their own command structure, their own communication. Systems. This isn't a quick in-and-out operation. Martha Caldwell moved closer, her teacher's instincts picking up on the fear that Elara was trying to hide. With all this military activity, maybe you should consider staying in town for a few days.
Hey, the church
has guest rooms. The offer of sanctuary was tempting, but Elara couldn't shake the feeling that leaving her property unattended would be a mistake. If something or someone was hidden on her land, abandoning it might mean losing her only chance to understand what was happening before the situation spiraled completely out of her control. I appreciate the offer, she said carefully, but I need to get back to the farm. There are animals to tend, equipment to secure. Henrik studied her with the sharp eyes of someone who'd been reading people for 70 years. You've seen something, haven't you? Something that's got you spooked enough to break your hermit habits and come asking questions. Elara hesitated, weighing the risks of sharing information against the potential benefits of community support. These people had known her family for generations. It respected her grief and her need for isolation, even when they didn't understand it. If anyone could be trusted with dangerous knowledge, it would be them. But before she could decide how much to reveal, the door chime rang again, and Wilhelm Steinhardt stumbled into the store. The old farmer's face was flushed, his breathing labored, and his usually immaculate clothing was disheveled and dirty. They're setting up roadblocks, he gasped, accepting the chair that Dr. Calloway quickly provided, both ends of the valley. No one gets in or out without military clearance. They told me I was lucky to make it to town before the perimeter was fully established. The implications of a sealed perimeter sent a chill through everyone in the store. Roadblocks meant this wasn't just a search operation, it was a containment operation. Whatever they were looking for was considered dangerous enough to warrant trapping an entire community until it was found. Did they say anything about evacuation? Pastor Benedict asked. Should we be preparing to move people to safety? Wilhelm shook his head, just the opposite. They want everyone to stay exactly where they are. No unnecessary travel, no large gatherings, no interference with military operations. They made it very clear that anyone who gets in their way will be treated as a potential threat. Elara felt the walls closing in around her with each piece of new information. A containment operation with shoot-first protocols, focused on her area of the valley, with preparations for casualties and an indefinite timeline. Whatever was hidden on or near her property, it was important enough to justify essentially placing an entire community under military occupation. Dr. Calloway moved to Wilhelm's side, checking his pulse and breathing with professional efficiency. You need to rest and hydrate. This level of stress isn't good for your heart condition. As the doctor tended to Wilhelm, Elara found herself studying the faces of her neighbor's people she'd known her entire life, but had barely spoken to in 3 years. They were frightened, confused, and looking to each other for reassurance that none of them could provide. The safe, predictable world of Thornwick Valley was disappearing around them, replaced by something that felt more like a war zone than a farming community. Martha Caldwell approached her quietly. Elara, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Have you seen anything unusual on your property? Anything that might explain why the military is so interested in this area?
It's a
direct question forced Elara to confront the growing certainty that she was at the center of whatever was happening. Her farm was the most isolated property in the affected area, the one place where someone could hide without being easily detected. If she was harboring a fugitive without knowing it, these people deserved to know what kind of danger they might be facing. I haven't seen anything obvious, she said slowly, but I also haven't been looking. I've been focused on my own work, my own routine. If someone wanted to hide on my property, there are places they could do it without me noticing. Henrik leaned forward, his expression serious. The old grain silos, the abandoned equipment shed near the creek, those buildings haven't been used in years, Elara nodded, or the wheat fields themselves. 300 acres of head-high grain could hide an army if they knew what they were doing. The realization of her own vulnerability hit her with stunning force. She'd been living alone on a property large enough to conceal significant threats, isolated enough that she might not discover danger until it was too late to respond effectively. Jacob Thorne, who'd been listening intently to the conversation, spoke up. You shouldn't go back there alone. If there's something the military wants badly enough to lock down the entire valley, it's not something you want to stumble across by yourself. The young man's concern was touching, but Elara knew. She couldn't accept help that might put others in danger. I can't ask anyone to share whatever risk I'm facing. This is my property, my responsibility. That's not how community works, Pastor Benedict said firmly. We don't abandon people to face danger alone, especially not people who've been part of this valley for generations. The Blackwood family has helped every family here at one time or another. It's time for us to return that favor. The offer of support brought unexpected tears to Elara's eyes. For 3 years, she'd convinced herself that isolation was safety, that caring about others only led to pain and loss. But faced with genuine danger, she discovered that human connection wasn't just comfort, it was survival. Before she could respond to the pastor's offer, the sound of heavy vehicles rumbling through the village square silenced all conversation. Through the store's windows, they could see a convoy of military trucks and armored personnel carriers moving slowly down the main street. Soldiers in full combat gear sat in the back of the trucks, their weapons visible and their expressions alert. The convoy stopped directly in front of the general store. A tall officer in crisp fatigues climbed out of the lead vehicle and approached the store entrance. Even through the glass, his bearing and the way the other soldiers deferred to him made it clear this was someone with significant authority. He paused just outside the door, apparently giving orders to subordinates through a radio headset. Nobody moves, Dr. Calloway whispered urgently. Nobody says anything that might be interpreted as threatening or uncooperative. The door chimed as the officer entered, followed by 2 armed soldiers who positioned themselves flanking the entrance. The officer's gaze swept the room, cataloging faces and assessing threat levels with professional efficiency. Good afternoon, he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from years of command. I'm Colonel Marcus Reeves, and I'm in charge of the security operation currently underway in this area. I need to speak with anyone who has property or business interests in the eastern section of the valley. Elara felt every eye in the room turn toward her. There was no point in trying to hide her identity or her connection to the area under scrutiny. The colonel's intelligence briefing had almost certainly included detailed information about every property owner in the target zone. "I'm Elara Blackwood," she said, stepping forward with as much courage as she could muster. "I own and operate a farm about 5 miles east of here." Colonel Reeves studied her with sharp blue eyes that seemed to see more than she was comfortable revealing. "Ms. Blackwood, I need to ask you some questions about activity on or near your property over the past 72 hours. Have you observed any unusual behavior, any signs of unauthorized presence, any disturbances that seemed out of the ordinary?" The question was phrased carefully, professionally, but Elara could hear the underlying urgency. Whatever they were looking for, time was a critical factor. The longer it remained hidden, the more dangerous the situation became. "They're setting up roadblocks," he gasped, accepting the chair that Dr. Calloway quickly provided, both ends of the valley. "No one gets in or out without military clearance. They told me I was lucky to make it to town before the perimeter was fully established." The implications of a sealed perimeter sent a chill through everyone in the store. Roadblocks meant this wasn't just a search operation, it was a containment operation. Whatever they were looking for was considered dangerous enough to warrant trapping an entire community until it was found. "Did they say anything about evacuation?" Pastor Benedict asked. "Should we be preparing to move people to safety?" Wilhelm shook his head. "Just the opposite. They want everyone to stay exactly where they are. No unnecessary travel, no large gatherings, no interference with military operations. They made it very clear that anyone who gets in their way will be treated as a potential threat." Elara felt the walls closing in around her with each piece of new information. A containment operation with shoot-first protocols, focused on her area of the valley, with preparations for casualties and an indefinite timeline. Whatever was hidden on or near her property, it was important enough to justify essentially placing an entire community under military occupation. Dr. Calloway moved to Wilhelm's side, checking his pulse and breathing with professional efficiency. "You need to rest and hydrate. This level of stress isn't good for your heart condition." As the doctor tended to Wilhelm, Elara found herself studying the faces of her neighbors, people she'd known her entire life, but had barely spoken to in 3 years. They were frightened, confused, and looking to each other for reassurance that none of them could provide. The safe, predictable world of Thornwick Valley was disappearing around them, replaced by something that felt more like a war zone than a farming community. Martha Caldwell approached her quietly. "Elara, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Have you seen anything unusual on your property? Anything that might explain why the military is so interested in this area?" It's a direct question forced Elara to confront the growing certainty that she was at the center of whatever was happening. Her farm was the most isolated property in the affected area, the one place where someone could hide without being easily detected. If she was harboring a fugitive without knowing it, these people deserved to know what kind of danger they might be facing. "I haven't seen anything obvious," she said slowly, "but I also haven't been looking. I've been focused on my own work, my own routine. If someone wanted to hide on my property, there are places they could do it without me noticing." Henrik leaned forward, his expression serious. The convoy that escorted Elara back to her farm moved with the kind of precision that spoke of extensive training and serious intent. Colonel Reeves rode in the lead vehicle with her, his presence filling the cab of her truck in a way that made every breath feel deliberate and watched. Behind them, 3 military vehicles followed at carefully measured intervals, their occupants scanning the landscape with the heightened awareness of soldiers expecting contact. As they approached the familiar gate that marked the entrance to her property, Elara felt a disorienting sense of seeing her own life from the outside. The farmhouse that had been her sanctuary now looked small and vulnerable against the backdrop of military might. The wheat fields that had provided her with predictable routine suddenly seemed vast and full of potential hiding places. She thought she knew about her own land was being recontextualized by the presence of armed men, who clearly expected to find something dangerous hidden within its boundaries. Colonel Reeves spoke into his radio as they passed through the gate, coordinating with units that were apparently already positioned around the perimeter of her property. The realization that soldiers had been watching her farm while she was in town sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the cooling afternoon air. Her sanctuary had been under surveillance, possibly for hours, without her knowledge or consent. "How long have your people been here?" she asked, trying to keep her voice neutral despite the anger building in her chest. "Long enough to establish that if there is an unauthorized presence on your property, they haven't attempted to leave since we began monitoring," Colonel Reeves replied. "Our intelligence suggests that whoever we're looking for is injured and unable to travel far or fast." The mention of an injured person triggered something unexpected in Eleron's fear, but a protective instinct she hadn't felt since Lydia's death. Someone was hurt and hiding, possibly on her land, and regardless of who they were or why the military wanted them. Her first impulse was to provide help rather than assistance in their capture. "What exactly did this person do?" she asked. "Are they so important that you're willing to lock down an entire valley to find them?" Colonel Reeves was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the approaching farmhouse. "That information is classified at levels above your security clearance. Ms. Blackwood, what I can tell you is that this individual poses a significant threat to national security, and their continued freedom could result in casualties on a scale that justifies extraordinary measures." The non-answer felt like a deliberate deflection, and Elara's suspicion grew stronger. In her experience, people who claimed to be protecting national security were often protecting something much more personal and much less noble. The military's willingness to essentially imprison an entire community suggested that whatever they were hiding was potentially embarrassing or incriminating. As they pulled up to the farmhouse, Elara noticed immediately that several of her outbuildings showed signs of having been searched. Doors that she always kept latched were standing slightly ajar. Equipment that she stored in specific arrangements had been moved and imperfectly replaced. The violation of her space felt more personal than the broader military occupation of the valley. "Your people have already been through my property," she said, not bothering to hide her anger. "Why do you need me here if you've already conducted your search?" "Initial reconnaissance," Colonel Reeves admitted. "But we need someone with intimate knowledge of the land to identify hiding places that might not be obvious to outside observers. 300 acres is a lot of ground to cover thoroughly, especially when dealing with someone who might have military training." The implication that their target had military training added another layer of complexity to the situation. It wasn't a simple criminal fugitive or even a foreign agent. This was someone with the skills and knowledge to evade professional military searchers. Someone who understood tactics and concealment well enough to remain hidden despite intensive efforts to locate them. Elara climbed out of her truck and immediately felt the weight of multiple sets of eyes watching her every movement. Soldiers were positioned at strategic points around her farmyard, their weapons held in ready positions, and their attention focused on potential threats rather than on her specifically. The transformation of her peaceful farm into what felt like a military base was jarring and deeply unsettling. "Where would you like to start?" she asked, resigned to cooperating but determined to maintain as much control over the situation as possible. Colonel Reeves consulted a tactical map that appeared to have been marked with the results of their preliminary search. "Your people mentioned grain silos and abandoned outbuildings. We've checked the obvious structures, but we need to examine areas where someone could create concealed shelter using natural features or existing infrastructure." Elara studied the map, noting that the military's understanding of her property was more detailed than she would have expected. They'd identified not just buildings and roads, but also natural features like creek beds, rock formations, and areas of dense vegetation that could provide cover. Someone had done extensive reconnaissance work, possibly using aerial surveillance or satellite imagery. "The old root cellar," she said, pointing to an area near the farmhouse that wasn't marked on their map. "My grandmother built it during the war years. It's partially underground and hidden by overgrown vegetation. If someone knew what to look for, they could shelter there without being easily detected." Colonel Reeves made a note on his map and spoke briefly into his radio. Within minutes, 2 soldiers were moving toward the area Elara had indicated, their approach careful and coordinated. The efficiency of their response suggested extensive training in search operations, but also a level of caution that indicated they expected their target to be armed and potentially dangerous. As they waited for the soldiers to report back, Elara found herself studying Colonel Reeves more carefully. He was younger than she'd initially estimated, probably in his earliest 40s, with the kind of bearing that came from years of command responsibility. But there was something in his expression, a tension around his eyes, a tightness in his jaw that suggested this operation was more personally significant than routine military business. "You know who you're looking for," she said, not making it a question. "This isn't about some anonymous fugitive. You know exactly who's out there and why they're running." Colonel Reeves met her gaze steadily. The convoy that escorted Elara back to her farm moved with the kind of precision that spoke of extensive training and serious intent. Colonel Reeves rode in the lead vehicle with her, his presence filling the cab of her truck in a way that made every breath feel deliberate and watched. Behind them, 3 military vehicles followed at carefully measured intervals, their occupants scanning the landscape with the heightened awareness of soldiers expecting contact. As they approached the familiar gate that marked the entrance to her property, Elara felt a disorienting sense of seeing her own life from the outside. The farmhouse that had been her sanctuary now looked small and vulnerable against the backdrop of military might. The wheat fields that had provided her with predictable routine suddenly seemed vast and full of potential hiding places. She thought she knew about her own land was being recontextualized by the presence of armed men, who clearly expected to find something dangerous hidden within its boundaries. Colonel Reeves spoke into his radio as they passed through the gate, coordinating with units that were apparently already positioned around the perimeter of her property. The realization that soldiers had been watching her farm while she was in town sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the cooling afternoon air. Her sanctuary had been under surveillance, possibly for hours, without her knowledge or consent. "How long have your people been here?" she asked, trying to keep her voice neutral despite the anger building in her chest. "Long enough to establish that if there is an unauthorized presence on your property, they haven't attempted to leave since we began monitoring," Colonel Reeves replied. "Our intelligence suggests that whoever we're looking for is injured and unable to travel far or fast." The mention of an injured person triggered something unexpected in Eleron's fear, but a protective instinct she hadn't felt since Lydia's death. Someone was hurt and hiding, possibly on her land, and regardless of who they were or why the military wanted them. Her first impulse was to provide help rather than assistance in their capture. "What exactly did this person do?" she asked. "Are they so important that you're willing to lock down an entire valley to find them?" Colonel Reeves was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the approaching farmhouse. "That information is classified at levels above your security clearance, Ms. Blackwood. What I can tell you is that this individual poses a significant threat to national security, and their continued freedom could result in casualties on a scale that justifies extraordinary measures." The non-answer felt like a deliberate deflection, and Elara's suspicion grew stronger. In her experience, "The wheat is ready for harvest," she said quietly. "If someone is hiding in there, they're probably trying to stay near the irrigation channels. Those areas have better water access and more substantial cover." Colonel Reeves looked at her sharply. "How many irrigation channels run through that section?" 3 main lines with probably a dozen smaller branches. Most of them are deep enough for someone to take cover if they needed to hide quickly, even as she provided the information. Elara felt conflicted about helping the military hunt someone who might be genuinely in need of sanctuary. The colonel spoke rapidly into his radio, coordinating what sounded like a systematic sweep of the wheat fields. Within minutes, Elara could see soldiers moving to positions around the perimeter of the grain, preparing to work their way inward. In a pattern designed to flush out anyone hiding within the crop, "I need you to come with us," Colonel Reeves said. "If we corner whoever is out there, your presence might help convince them to surrender peacefully, rather than forcing a confrontation that could result in casualties." The request felt like being asked to collaborate in her own violation. These soldiers were preparing to hunt through her fields, trampling crops she'd tended for months, in pursuit of someone who might be nothing more than a scared, injured person looking for help. The protective instincts that had been dormant for 3 years were awakening with uncomfortable intensity. "What if they're not dangerous?" she asked. What if they're just someone who got hurt and needed a place to hide while they recovered? Then they should have sought help through proper channels, instead of trespassing on private property and evading lawful military authority. Colonel Reeves replied firmly. Ms. Blackwood, I understand that this situation is difficult for you, but you need to understand that we're not the villains here. We're trying to prevent something that could cost innocent lives. The certainty in his voice was undermined by the doubt in his eyes, and Elara realized that Colonel Reeves might not be entirely convinced of his own arguments. Whatever orders he was following, whatever mission he was pursuing, there were aspects of it that didn't sit comfortably with his personal sense of justice. As they prepared to enter the wheat fields, Elara found herself caught between conflicting loyalties. Her rational mind understood that she should cooperate with legitimate authority, especially if there was genuine danger involved. But her emotional instincts were drawing her toward protecting whoever was hiding in her grain, regardless of who they were or what they might have done. The soldiers began their sweep with military precision, moving through the wheat in coordinated lines designed to cover maximum area while maintaining mutual support. The sound of their movement through the grain created a rhythmic rustling that carried across the fields, punctuated by occasional radio communications and the careful footsteps of men trained to move through hostile territory. Elara followed Colonel Reeves into the grain, feeling like an intruder in her own fields. The wheat that had provided her with comfort and routine now felt alien and threatening, transformed by the presence of armed men into a potential battlefield. Every shadow between the stalks could hide a person. Every sound could indicate discovery or confrontation. 20 minutes into the search, they found the first significant evidence that their target was still nearby. A soldier near the central irrigation channel called out that he'd discovered recently used medical supplies and what appeared to be a makeshift shelter constructed from cut grain stalks and canvas that might have been salvaged from farm equipment. Still warm, the soldier reported as they approached his position. Whoever was here left very recently, probably within the last hour. Colonel Reeves studied the abandoned shelter with growing frustration. They're staying ahead of us, moving when they hear us coming. This person has too much training and too much familiarity with evasion tactics for us to corner them using conventional search patterns. Elara examined the medical supplies that had been left behind and felt a pang of sympathy that surprised her with its intensity. Blood-stained bandages, empty pain medication containers, and improvised splinting materials told the story of someone dealing with significant injuries while trying to remain hidden. Whoever was out there was hurt, probably badly, and was choosing continued flight over medical treatment that might save their life. They're getting worse, she said quietly. These supplies suggest someone with serious injuries who's been trying to treat themselves. They can't keep this up much longer. Which is exactly why we need to find them quickly, Colonel Reeves replied. Before they collapse somewhere, we can't locate them, or before desperation drives them to do something that puts civilians at risk. As if summoned by his words, a sound carried across the wheat fields that made every soldier freeze in position. It was faint, almost lost in the rustling of grain and the whisper of wind, but unmistakably human. Someone was crying, not the dramatic sobs of fear or pain, but the quiet, exhausted weeping of someone who had reached the limits of endurance. The sound was coming from somewhere deeper in the wheat, in a direction that the search teams hadn't yet reached. Without conscious thought, Elara began moving toward it, driven by instincts that had nothing to do with military objectives or national security concerns. Someone was hurt and alone and crying, and every maternal impulse she possessed demanded that she respond. Ms. Blackwood, stop, Colonel Reeves called urgently. Let my people handle this. The ray was already pushing through the grain stalks, following the sound of weeping toward a confrontation that would force her to choose between the safety of compliance and the dangerous responsibility of protecting someone who might be nothing more than a frightened child in need of help. Behind her, she could hear Colonel Reeves coordinating his soldiers, preparing for a confrontation that he clearly hoped would end peacefully, but was ready to escalate if necessary. The next few minutes would determine whether this military operation concluded with a quiet surrender or with violence that would shatter the illusion of safety that had protected Thornwick Valley for generations. As Elara pushed deeper into her own wheat fields, guided by the sound of someone's pain, she realized that the person she was about to encounter would either confirm her worst fears about military overreach or justify the extreme measures that had turned her peaceful farm into a combat zone. Either way, her life was about to change in ways she couldn't predict or control. The crying grew slightly louder as she moved through the grain, and with it came the unsettling realization that the voice sounded young, possibly very young. Whatever she was walking toward wasn't the hardened military fugitive that Colonel Reeves had described, but someone who sounded barely old enough to be out of school, let alone involved in matters of national security. Behind her, she could hear the soldiers adjusting their approach, trying to maintain tactical positioning while following her unauthorized advance into the wheat. Their training demanded they control the situation, but their caution suggested they were as uncertain as she was about what they might find in the grain. "The voice sounds female," she called back to Colonel Reeves, not caring if her observation might compromise some aspect of their operational security. "And young, very young." The colonel's response was sharp and immediate. "Age and gender don't necessarily correlate with threat level. Ms. Blackwood, some of the most dangerous operatives we've encountered have been people who don't fit obvious profiles." His words carried professional conviction. But Elara detected something else beneath the surface, a note of uncertainty that suggested he might be questioning his own assumptions about whoever they were pursuing. The possibility that their high-value target might be little more than a frightened child was clearly not something he'd prepared for emotionally, regardless of what his training had taught him to expect. The wheat around her was thicker here, planted in rows that created natural corridors, but also provided countless opportunities for concealment. The irrigation channel she'd mentioned was nearby, its concrete banks rising slightly above the level of the surrounding field and creating a depression that would be invisible from more than a few feet away. It was there, nestled against the channel's sloped side and partially hidden by grain stalks that had been carefully bent to provide overhead cover, that Elara found her. The young woman she was definitely young, probably no more than 19 or 20, was curled into a defensive position that spoke of both physical pain and psychological trauma. Her clothing was military in style, but torn and stained with blood and mud. Her dark hair was matted and tangled, and her face was streaked with dirt and tears. But it was her eyes that stopped Elara's heart. They were the eyes of someone who had seen too much, lost too much, and was now facing the prospect of losing even more. They held the kind of deep exhaustion that came not just from physical injury, but from carrying emotional burdens that were too heavy for someone so young. "Please," the girl whispered, her voice barely audible above the rustling of grain stalks. "Please don't let them take me back." The words hit Elara like a physical blow. This wasn't a dangerous operative or a security threat. This was a child who was running from something. Someone who was so desperate to avoid capture that she was willing to risk death from untreated injuries rather than surrender to the military forces hunting her. "It's all right," Elara said softly, moving slowly so as not to frighten the girl further. "I'm not going to hurt you. My name is Elara, and this is my farm. You're safe here." Even as she spoke the words, she knew they weren't entirely true. Girl wasn't safe, not with dozens of armed soldiers systematically searching the area, and a colonel who seemed personally invested in her capture. But something about the young woman's vulnerability triggered every protective instinct Elara possessed, overwhelming her rational understanding of the situation. The girl tried to sit up but immediately gasped in pain and pressed a hand to her side. Through the tears in her clothing, Elara could see evidence of serious injuries, what looked like bullet wounds that had been roughly bandaged, but were clearly in need of proper medical attention. "You're hurt," Elara said, moving closer. Despite the girl's obvious fear, "You need medical care. Those wounds could become infected, or you could lose too much blood." "They'll find me if I go to a hospital," the girl replied, her voice stronger now but still filled with desperation. "They'll drag me back, and this time they won't let me live long enough to run again." The implication that someone had already tried to kill this young woman sent a chill through Elara that had nothing to do with the cooling afternoon air. Whatever was happening here went beyond simple military discipline or law enforcement. This girl was running for her life. The people pursuing her wore the same uniforms as the men who had taken Elara's daughter away forever. "Who are you?" Elara asked gently. "What's your name?" The girl hesitated, clearly weighing the risks of revealing personal information against the potential benefits of establishing trust with someone who might be able to help her. "Zara," she said finally. "My name is Zara Castellano. I used to be a lieutenant in the same army that's hunting me now." The revelation that their fugitive was military personnel, specifically someone who had held rank, responsibility, add new layers of complexity to an already complicated situation. This wasn't a deserter or a conscientious objector. This was someone who had been part of the system and had apparently discovered something significant enough to justify both her flight and the extraordinary efforts being made to recapture her. "What did you see?" Elara asked, though part of her didn't want to know the answer. "What happened that made you run?" Zara's eyes filled with fresh tears, and for a moment she looked even younger than her apparent age. "They killed civilians," she whispered. "My unit was ordered to eliminate a village that was supposedly harboring insurgents. But when we got there, it was just families, old people, children, mothers with babies. And when I tried to report it, when I tried to follow proper channels," she didn't need to finish the sentence. The bullet wounds and her current status as a fugitive told the rest of the story with brutal clarity. Zara had witnessed war crimes, attempted to report them through official channels, and been targeted for elimination rather than being allowed to testify or seek justice. The sound of approaching soldiers grew louder, and Elara realized that their conversation was about to be interrupted by men who might not be interested in hearing Zara's side of the story. Whatever had happened in that distant village, whatever crimes had been committed and covered up, the people hunting this young woman were unlikely to let her live long enough to tell her story to anyone who might be able to act on it. "Ms. Blackwood." Colonel Reeves' voice cut through the grain stalks with military authority. "We know you've found something. I need you to step away from the target and allow my people to secure the area." The clinical term target applied to the injured young woman beside her triggered something fierce and protective in Elara's chest. Zara wasn't a target. She was a person who had tried to do the right thing and been betrayed by the very system she had sworn to serve. "She's hurt," Elara called back, not moving away from Zara's position. "She needs medical attention, not military detention." "Medical attention will be provided once she's been secured," Colonel Reeves replied, his voice closer now as he moved through the wheat toward their position. "I need you to move away from her immediately." But Elara found herself unable to comply with the order. Looking at Zara young, wounded and terrified, she saw not a military fugitive, but a reflection of her own daughter. Lydia had been the same age when she'd enlisted, driven by the same sense of duty and honor that had ultimately led to her death in a foreign land. The parallels were too strong to ignore, and the possibility that Zara might face the same fate filled Elara with a rage that surprised her with its intensity. "What happened to her unit?" she asked Zara quietly. "The other soldiers who were there when the civilians were killed?" "Dead," Zara replied, her voice hollow with survivor's guilt. "All of them. Officially, they died in combat with insurgent forces. Unofficially, they were eliminated to prevent them from corroborating my testimony." The implication that an entire military unit had been murdered to cover up war crimes was almost too horrific to process. But it explained the extraordinary efforts being made to recapture Zara, as well as Colonel Reeves' personal investment in the operation. This wasn't about national security. It was about protecting people in positions of power who had ordered atrocities and were now willing to commit more atrocities to keep their crimes hidden. The wheat stalks around them rustled as multiple soldiers approached their position from different directions. Within moments, Elara and Zara would be surrounded by armed men who had orders to capture or kill the young woman who knew too much. The words hit Elara like a physical blow. This wasn't a dangerous operative or a security threat. This was a child who was running from something. Someone who was so desperate to avoid capture that she was willing to risk death from untreated injuries rather than surrender to the military forces hunting her. "It's all right," Elara said softly, moving slowly so as not to frighten the girl further. "I'm not going to hurt you. My name is Elara, and this is my farm. You're safe here." Even as she spoke the words, she knew they weren't entirely true. Girl wasn't safe, not with dozens of armed soldiers systematically searching the area, and a colonel who seemed personally invested in her capture. But something about the young woman's vulnerability triggered every protective instinct Elara possessed, overwhelming her rational understanding of the situation. The girl tried to sit up but immediately gasped in pain and pressed a hand to her side. Through the tears in her clothing, Elara could see evidence of serious injuries, what looked like bullet wounds that had been roughly bandaged, but were clearly in need of proper medical attention. "You're hurt," Elara said, moving closer. Despite the girl's obvious fear, "You need medical care. Those wounds could become infected, or you could lose too much blood." "They'll find me if I go to a hospital," the girl replied, her voice stronger now but still filled with desperation. "They'll drag me back, and this time they won't let me live long enough to run again." The implication that someone had already tried to kill this young woman sent a chill through Elara that had nothing to do with the cooling afternoon air. Whatever was happening here went beyond simple military discipline or law enforcement. This girl was running for her life. The people pursuing her wore the same uniforms as the men who had taken Elara's daughter away forever. "Who are you?" Elara asked gently. "What's your name?" The girl hesitated, clearly weighing the risks of revealing personal information against the potential benefits of establishing trust with someone who might be able to help her. "Zara," she said finally. "My name is Zara Castellano. I used to be a lieutenant in the same army that's hunting me now." The revelation that their fugitive was military personnel, specifically someone who had held rank, responsibility, add new layers of complexity to an already complicated situation. This wasn't a deserter or a conscientious objector. This was someone who had been part of the system and had apparently discovered something significant enough to justify both her flight and the extraordinary efforts being made to recapture her. "What did you see?" Elara asked, though part of her didn't want to know the answer. "What happened that made you run?" Zara's eyes filled with fresh tears, and for a moment she looked even younger than her apparent age. "They killed civilians," she whispered. "My unit was ordered to eliminate a village that was supposedly harboring insurgents. But when we got there, it was just families, old people, children, mothers with babies. And when I tried to report it, when I tried to follow proper channels," she didn't need to finish the sentence. The bullet wounds and her current status as a fugitive told the rest of the story with brutal clarity. Zara had witnessed war crimes, attempted to report them through official channels, and been targeted for elimination rather than being allowed to testify or seek justice. The sound of approach. Colonel Reeves studied Elara's face, perhaps seeing something there that reminded him of why he had originally chosen to serve his country. The tension in his shoulders suggested a man wrestling with competing loyalties, trying to balance his duty to follow orders against his personal sense of justice. "What exactly are you proposing?" he asked quietly, his question directed as much to his own conscience as to the woman standing between his soldiers and their target. It was a question that would require an answer that could save lives or cost them, that could expose truth or bury it forever. And as Elara looked into the faces of the young soldiers surrounding them, she realized that some of them were barely older than Zara, barely older than Lydia had been when she'd died believing she was serving something greater than herself. The next words spoken would determine whether that service meant anything, or whether it was just another lie told to young people willing to die for ideals that their leaders had long since abandoned. The silence that followed Elara's challenge stretched across the wheat field like a held breath, heavy with the weight of decisions that could not be undone. Colonel Reeves stood motionless for what felt like an eternity, his gaze moving between the wounded young woman he'd been ordered to capture and the civilian farmer who had positioned herself as an obstacle to those orders. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weariness that suggested the burden of command had grown heavier than he'd expected when he'd accepted this mission. "Stand down," he said quietly to his soldiers, though his eyes never left Elara's face. "Lower your weapons and establish a defensive perimeter, but do not advance on the targets." The soldiers exchanged uncertain glances, clearly unprepared for orders that seemed to contradict their original mission parameters. But military discipline won out over confusion, and they began repositioning themselves as directed, creating a circle around Elara and Zara, but maintaining enough distance to suggest negotiation rather than immediate capture. "Colonel 1, of the soldiers began, his voice tight with professional concern. Our orders were explicit regarding the recovery of the target. Our orders. Colonel Reeves interrupted firmly, were to locate and assess the situation. That assessment is ongoing. He turned his attention back to Elara, studying her with the careful evaluation of someone trying to read an opponent's intentions. Ms. Blackwood, you've placed yourself in an extremely dangerous position. I need to understand exactly what you think you're accomplishing here. Elara felt Zara's hand grip her arm, a silent reminder of the trust that had been placed in her protection. The young woman's injuries were clearly worsening. Her breathing was becoming more labored, and blood was seeping through the makeshift bandages she'd applied to her wounds. Whatever decision was made here needed to happen quickly, before medical emergency removed all other considerations from the equation. Protecting someone who tried to do the right thing, Elara replied, her voice steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. Someone who witnessed crimes and attempted to report them through proper channels, only to be targeted for assassination by the very people she trusted to uphold justice. Colonel Reeves' expression flickered with something that might have been recognition or guilt. You don't understand the complexities of military operations, Ms. Blackwood. Sometimes situations develop that require difficult decisions. Choices that civilian oversight might not stop. The word came from Zara, spoken with enough force to cut through the colonel's explanation. Despite her obvious pain and exhaustion, she struggled to stand straighter, facing the man who represented everything she'd once believed in, and everything she now feared. Stop pretending this is about military necessity or operational complexity. You know exactly what happened in that village, just like you know exactly why I'm being hunted. Colonel Reeves' jaw tightened, and for the first time since arriving at the farm, he looked genuinely uncomfortable. Lieutenant Castellano, you were relieved of duty pending investigation into serious allegations of insubordination and unauthorized disclosure of classified materials. I was marked for execution, Zara interrupted, her voice gaining strength, as anger overrode fear. Just like every other member of my unit who witnessed the massacre of civilians, just like anyone else who might be able to testify about what really happened when command decided that village was an acceptable loss for whatever larger strategy they were pursuing. The accusation hung in the air between them, and Elara could see its impact on the soldiers who were listening. Several of them shifted uncomfortably, their expressions suggesting that Zara's words were confirming suspicions they'd harbored, but hadn't been willing to voice. Colonel Reeves was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a different quality, less certainty, more conflict. What you're describing would constitute war crimes. Such allegations require proper investigation through appropriate channels. What channels? Zara demanded, taking a step forward despite Elara's restraining hand. The same channels that resulted in assassination orders rather than court-martial proceedings? The same command structure that decided covering up atrocities was more important than honoring the oath we all swore to protect innocent lives? The young woman reached into her jacket, moving slowly to avoid triggering defensive reactions from the surrounding soldiers, and withdrew a waterproof packet that had clearly been carried with great care despite her recent ordeal. I have evidence, she said, holding the packet up so everyone could see it. Video recordings, official communications, medical reports from the aftermath. Documentation that proves beyond any doubt what happened in that village and who ordered it covered up. Colonel Reeves stared at the packet as if it contained explosives rather than documents. Lieutenant, possession of those materials constitutes multiple violations of military law and national security protocols, and the actions they document constitute crimes against humanity, Zara replied without hesitation. Which law takes precedence, Colonel? The law that protects criminals in uniform, or the law that demands justice for murdered civilians? The question forced Colonel Reeves to confront the fundamental conflict that had been driving his internal struggle throughout this operation. Elara could see the war playing out across his features: duty versus conscience, orders versus justice, institutional loyalty versus personal integrity. Around them, the afternoon light was beginning to fade, casting long shadows across the wheat field and reminding everyone present that time was becoming a critical factor. Zara's condition was deteriorating. The military operation couldn't continue indefinitely without attracting unwanted attention, and decisions that had been postponed for hours would soon be forced by circumstance. "What do you want, Colonel?" Reeves asked finally, the question directed to both women, but particularly to Elara, whose protection had created the current standoff. Elara looked at Zara, seeing in the young woman's determined expression the same idealism that had driven her daughter Lydia to serve her country even when that service cost her life. The parallel was too strong to ignore, and it clarified what needed to happen with startling certainty. "Safe passage," she said firmly. "Medical treatment for her injuries, and safe passage to journalists or investigators who can review her evidence and take appropriate action." "That's not something I can authorize, Colonel Reeves." Colonel Reeves studied Elara's face, perhaps seeing something there that reminded him of why he had originally chosen to serve his country. The tension in his shoulders suggested a man wrestling with competing loyalties, trying to balance his duty to follow orders against his personal sense of justice. "What exactly are you proposing?" he asked quietly, his question directed as much to his own conscience as to the woman standing between his soldiers and their target. It was a question that would require an answer that could save lives or cost them, that could expose truth or bury it forever. And as Elara looked into the faces of the young soldiers surrounding them, she realized that some of them were barely older than Zara, barely older than Lydia had been when she died believing she was serving something greater than herself. The next words spoken would determine whether that service meant anything, or whether it was just another lie told to young people willing to die for ideals that their leaders had long since abandoned. The silence that followed Elara's challenge stretched across the wheat field like a held breath, heavy with the weight of decisions that could not be undone. Colonel Reeves stood motionless for what felt like an eternity, his gaze moving between the wounded young woman he'd been ordered to capture and the civilian farmer who had positioned herself as an obstacle to those orders. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weariness that suggested the burden of command had grown heavier than he'd expected when he'd accepted this mission. "Stand down," he said quietly to his soldiers, though his eyes never left Elara's face. "Lower your weapons and establish a defensive perimeter, but do not advance on the targets." The soldiers exchanged uncertain glances, clearly unprepared for orders that seemed to contradict their original mission parameters. "But military discipline one, is it?" Zara pressed, despite her obvious weakness. "How many operations like this have you been involved in, Colonel? How many times have you been told that national security required actions that conflicted with everything you were taught? About honor and duty?" The question struck home with devastating accuracy. Colonel Reeves' expression shifted from professional authority to something approaching anguish, as if Zara had articulated doubts that had been growing in his mind for longer than he cared to admit. "My orders," he began, but Zara cut him off with a gesture that was both dismissive and compassionate. "Your orders come from people who see soldiers as expendable resources rather than human beings with consciences and families," she said. "How long before following those orders costs you everything you thought you were fighting to protect?" The silence that followed was filled with the sound of wind moving through grain stalks and the distant rumble of vehicles that suggested the larger military operation was continuing despite the standoff in the wheat field. But among the immediate participants, the only sound was breathing and the subtle shifting of equipment as men reconsidered assumptions they'd held about duty, service, and the nature of the orders they'd been following. Colonel Reeves removed his radio headset and set it carefully on the ground beside his feet. The gesture was small, but symbolically enormous. Commanding officer choosing to disconnect from the command structure that had defined his entire adult life? "Sergeant Morrison," he said to one of his soldiers, "what's your assessment of the medical situation?" The soldier he'd addressed moved carefully toward Zara, clearly evaluating her condition with professional expertise. "Significant blood loss, probable internal injuries, exhaustion, and dehydration. She needs immediate medical attention or she's going to go into shock. And our tactical situation, defensible but not sustainable," Morrison replied without hesitation. "If this operation extends much longer, we're going to have civilian interference, media attention, and questions from higher command that were not prepared to answer. Colonel Reeves nodded slowly as if the sergeant's assessment had confirmed conclusions he'd already reached. Ms. Blackwood, if I were to facilitate safe passage for Lieutenant Castellano, what guarantee could you provide that the materials she's carrying would be handled responsibly? The question represented a fundamental shift in the nature of their negotiation. Colonel Reeves was no longer talking about capturing a fugitive. He was exploring options for protecting a whistleblower while minimizing the political fallout for everyone involved. I have contacts, Elara said carefully. Dr. Calloway has connections with medical personnel who've worked in conflict zones. They understand the need for discretion while ensuring proper care. And Pastor Benedict has relationships with journalists who specialize in investigating military misconduct. That's not enough, Zara interjected weakly. The evidence needs to reach people with the authority to act on it, not just report on it. Congressional oversight committees, international tribunals, prosecutors who can actually bring charges. Colonel Reeves was quiet for several minutes, clearly struggling with a decision that would define the rest of his career and possibly his life. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had chosen principle over self-preservation. There's a protocol, he said slowly, for military personnel who wish to report suspected war crimes through channels outside the normal command structure. It's rarely used because it effectively ends military careers, but it exists. He looked directly at Zara, his expression serious but no longer hostile. If you were to surrender voluntarily, agree to submit to medical treatment, and request formal whistleblower protection, I could facilitate contact with the appropriate oversight authorities. And if those authorities decide that covering up the crimes is more convenient than prosecuting them,
as
Zara asked, then you'll be in the same position you're in now, except you'll be alive, and your evidence will be in the hands of people who might be able to act on it, Colonel Reeves replied. It's not a perfect solution, but it's better than bleeding too. Death in a wheat field. Elara found herself caught between admiration for the colonel's courage in offering an alternative to his original orders and concern that Zara was being asked to trust a system that had already betrayed her once. The decision ultimately belonged to the young woman whose life hung in the balance, but Elara felt compelled to offer her perspective. Sometimes the best we can do is take the next right step, she said quietly, thinking of her own journey from isolation to engagement, from despair to hope. Not the perfect step, just the one that moves us closer to where we need to be. Zara looked at Elara with eyes that held gratitude, fear, and something that might have been peace. You remind me of someone, she said softly. An officer I knew who believed that doing right was more important than following orders. She died protecting civilians who would never know her name. The words hit Elara with unexpected force. And for a moment she could see Lydia in Zara's place, young, idealistic, willing to sacrifice everything for principles that seemed to matter, less to the people in charge than to the people asked to die for them. What was her name? Elara asked. Lieutenant Lydia Blackwood, Zara replied, and the world seemed to stop moving around them. The revelation that Zara had known her daughter, had served with her, had witnessed her death, sent shockwaves through Elara's carefully constructed emotional defenses. Everything she thought she understood about Lydia's death, about the circumstances that had taken her daughter away, suddenly became questionable. You knew my daughter? She managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. She saved my life, Zara said simply, and the lives of 12 civilians who would have died if she hadn't chosen to disobey direct orders to abandon them. The official report said she died in combat with enemy forces, but that's not what happened. She died protecting people our command had written off as acceptable casualties. The truth about Lydia's death, that she had died as Elara had always hoped she had, protecting innocent lives rather than serving political objectives, is it? Zara pressed, despite her obvious weakness. How many operations like this have you been involved in, Colonel? How many times have you been told that national security required actions that conflicted with everything you were taught? About honor and duty? The question struck home with devastating accuracy. Colonel Reeves' expression shifted from professional authority to something approaching anguish. as if Zara had articulated doubts that had been growing in his mind for longer than he cared to admit. "My orders," he began, but Zara cut him off with a gesture that was both dismissive and compassionate. "Your orders come from people who see soldiers as expendable resources rather than human beings with consciences and families," she said. "How long before following those orders costs you everything you thought you were fighting to protect?" The silence that followed was filled with the sound of wind moving through grain stalks and the distant rumble of vehicles that suggested the larger military operation was continuing despite the standoff in the wheat field. But among the immediate participants, the only sound was breathing and the subtle shifting of equipment as men reconsidered assumptions they'd held about duty, service, and the nature of the orders they'd been following. Colonel Reeves removed his radio headset and set it carefully on the ground beside his feet. The gesture was small, but symbolically enormous. Commanding officer choosing to disconnect from the command structure that had defined his entire adult life? "Sergeant Morrison," he said to one of his soldiers, "what's your assessment of the medical situation?" The soldier he'd addressed moved carefully toward Zara, clearly evaluating her condition with professional expertise. "Significant blood loss, probable internal injuries, exhaustion, and dehydration. She needs immediate medical attention or she's going to go into shock. And our tactical situation, defensible but not sustainable," Morrison replied without hesitation. "Today, if this operation extends much longer, we're going to have civilian interference, media attention, and questions from higher command that we're not prepared to answer." Colonel Reeves nodded slowly as if the sergeant's assessment had confirmed conclusions he'd already reached. "Ms. Blackwood, if I were to facilitate safe passage for Lieutenant Castellano, what guarantee could you provide that the materials she's carrying would be handled responsibly?" The question represented a fundamental shift in the nature of their negotiation. Colonel Reeves was no longer talking about capturing a fugitive. He was exploring options for protecting a whistleblower while minimizing the political fallout for everyone involved. "I have contacts," Elara said carefully. "Dr. Calloway has connections with medical personnel who've worked in conflict zones. They understand." Elara nodded. Understanding that she was being entrusted with more than just documents, she was being given the responsibility to ensure that her daughter's sacrifice, and the sacrifices of everyone who had died protecting the innocent, would not be forgotten or ignored. 6 months later, Elara stood in her kitchen reading news reports about international arrest warrants issued for military officers involved in the systematic murder of civilians. Congressional hearings were exposing decades of cover-ups and institutional corruption. Zara, now recovered from her injuries, was testifying before international tribunals, assuring that the truth about war crimes could no longer be hidden or denied. The farmhouse no longer felt like a tomb. Lydia's room had been converted into an office where Elara coordinated with human rights organizations, using her property as a safe house for other whistleblowers and refugees who needed protection while seeking justice. The isolation she had chosen after Lydia's death had been replaced by engagement with a community of people who shared her commitment to protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Her farm had become a symbol of resistance to institutional corruption, a place where truth could be spoken and defended. Outside her kitchen window, the wheat fields stretched toward the mountains, ready for another harvest. But now they represented more than just routine agricultural work. They represented the cycles of loss and renewal, of truth buried and truth revealed, of justice delayed but not ultimately denied. When Colonel Reeves came to visit, as he did, monthly, to provide updates on the ongoing investigations, he found Elara working in her garden, planting vegetables that would feed the next group of people who needed sanctuary while fighting for justice. "Any regrets?" he asked, settling into the chair she offered him on her front porch. Elara looked out across her land, thinking of Lydia, of Zara, of all the people whose courage had made it possible for truth to emerge from decades of official silence. "Only that it took me so long to understand that healing doesn't come from hiding," she said. "It comes from choosing to care about something bigger than your own safety." As the sun set over Thornwick Valley, casting golden light across fields that had once hidden secrets but now grew food for people committed to revealing truth, Elara understood that some storms don't destroy, they clear the air for something better to grow the girl she had sheltered, had given her more than evidence of crimes that needed prosecution. She had given her back her daughter's legacy, her own sense of purpose, and proof that sometimes the most important battles are fought, not with weapons, but with the courage to open your heart to someone who needs protection. In the growing dusk, Elara began planning for the arrival of the next person who would need sanctuary, the next truth that would need protection, the next opportunity to honor her daughter's memory by ensuring that those who died protecting the innocent would never be forgotten. The farm that had once been a refuge from the world had become a refuge for the world. And in that transformation, Elara had found the healing she never thought possible. Standing in her kitchen 6 months later, Elara reflected on how completely her life had changed. The house that had once felt like a mausoleum now buzzed with quiet activity. Dr. Calloway stopped by twice weekly, not just to check on her health, but to coordinate medical care for the refugees and whistleblowers who found temporary sanctuary on her property. Pastor Benedict had become her unofficial liaison with journalists and human rights organizations, his network of contacts proving invaluable in ensuring that evidence reached the right people. Even Wilhelm Steinhardt had been transformed by the events of that autumn day. The gruff farmer, who had barely spoken to anyone for years now, served as an early warning system. His suspicious nature and radio monitoring skills, perfectly suited to detecting when potentially dangerous individuals might be approaching the valley. His property had become an unofficial checkpoint where people could be vetted before being brought to Elara's farm. The transformation of Thornwick Valley itself was remarkable. What had once been an isolated farming community was now quietly known among human rights advocates as a place where truth could be protected and justice could be sought. The residents had developed an informal network for providing support, supplies, and cover stories when necessary. Martha Caldwell's school had become a source of educational materials in multiple languages. Henrik's store served as a discreet communication hub where messages could be passed without attracting unwanted attention. But it was the changes in Elara herself that were most profound. The woman who had once avoided human contact now found herself coordinating complex operations involving multiple organizations across several countries. The isolation that had once felt like protection now seemed like a waste of resources that could have been helping people years earlier. Her morning routine had evolved to include secure communications with international investigators, reviewing requests for sanctuary from people around the world, and coordinating with the network of supporters who made her work possible. The grandfather clock that had once marked empty hours now counted down time until the next arrival, the next crisis, the next opportunity to make a difference. The evidence Zara had carried out of those wheat fields had proven to be even more damaging to military corruption than anyone had initially realized. The documents didn't just expose the massacre that had triggered Zara's flight, they revealed a pattern of systematic cover-ups spanning decades. Military units that had reported combat deaths were found to have been eliminated to prevent testimony about war crimes. Civilian casualties that had been dismissed as collateral damage were revealed to have been deliberate targets. The international investigation that followed had expanded far beyond the original incident, uncovering a network of corruption that reached the highest levels of military and political leadership. Officers who had built careers on false heroics found themselves facing war crimes tribunals. Politicians who had authorized atrocities in the name of national security were confronted with evidence of their crimes. Colonel Reeves had paid a significant personal price for his decision to protect Zara, rather than follow his original orders. His military career had effectively ended the day he chose conscience over compliance, but he had found new purpose. Working with international oversight organizations, his insider knowledge of military operations, and his credibility as a career officer who had risked everything for truth made him an invaluable resource for investigators.
The monthly visits
he paid to Elara had evolved into planning sessions, where they coordinated efforts to protect other whistleblowers and refugees. His experience with military protocols and her growing network of civilian supporters created a combination that had proven remarkably effective at keeping people safe while their testimonies worked their way through various legal systems. Latest reports suggest 3 more arrest warrants will be issued next week, Colonel Reeves said during one of these visits. Settling into the chair that had become his usual spot on Elara's front porch, people who thought they were untouchable discovering that evidence has a way of surviving even the most systematic cover-up attempts. Elara poured coffee for both of them, noting how much more relaxed the colonel appeared now that he was working for justice rather than institutional preservation. The weight that had been visible in his shoulders during that confrontation in the wheat field had lifted, replaced by the energy that came from believing in the work you were doing. "Any word from Zara?" she asked, settling into her own chair. And look, Elara nodded. Understanding that she was being entrusted with more than just documents, she was being given the responsibility to ensure that her daughter's sacrifice, and the sacrifices of everyone who had died protecting the innocent, would not be forgotten or ignored. 6 months later, Elara stood in her kitchen reading news reports about international arrest warrants issued for military officers involved in the systematic murder of civilians. Congressional hearings were exposing decades of cover-ups and institutional corruption. Zara, now recovered from her injuries, was testifying before international tribunals, assuring that the truth about war crimes could no longer be hidden or denied. The farmhouse no longer felt like a tomb. Lydia's room had been converted into an office where Elara coordinated with human rights organizations, using her property as a safe house for other whistleblowers and refugees who needed protection while seeking justice. The isolation she had chosen after Lydia's death had been replaced by engagement with a community of people who shared her commitment to protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Her farm had become a symbol of resistance to institutional corruption, a place where truth could be spoken and defended. Outside her kitchen window, the wheat fields stretched toward the mountains, ready for another harvest. But now they represented more than just routine agricultural work. They represented the cycles. The support network they were discussing had grown organically from the connections made during Zara's recovery. Soldiers who had witnessed atrocities, civilians who had survived military crimes, investigators who had been silenced or transferred for asking difficult questions, all of them had found ways to connect and support each other through the complex process of seeking justice against powerful institutions. Elara's farm had become an unofficial coordination center for these efforts. Her isolation transformed into a strategic advantage that allowed sensitive meetings and communications to take place without attracting unwanted attention. The buildings that had once housed only memories now served as temporary shelters, meeting spaces, and secure storage for evidence that could change the course of legal proceedings. "There's something else," Colonel Reeves said, his tone shifting, to suggest the importance of what he was about to share. "We've received intelligence suggesting that there may be other sites like this one developing in different parts of the country. The model we've created here, community-based protection for whistleblowers and refugees, is being replicated by people who understand that sometimes justice requires civilian involvement." The idea that their work in Thornwick Valley was inspiring. Similar efforts elsewhere filled Elara with both pride and apprehension. Pride because it suggested that the principles they were fighting for were resonating with people who had the courage to act on them. Apprehension because it also meant that the forces they were opposing would likely intensify their efforts to shut down such operations. "Are we prepared for increased scrutiny?" she asked. "If there are multiple sites operating, it's only a matter of time before someone decides to make an example of one of them." Colonel Reeves was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing the risks they faced against the importance of the work they were doing. "We've been developing contingency plans," he said finally. "Networks for moving people quickly if necessary. Alternative communication systems. Legal protection for the property owners who are taking these risks." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of a vehicle approaching on the main road. Both Elara and Colonel Reeves tensed automatically, their relaxed discussion replaced by the alertness that had become second nature when dealing with potentially dangerous situations. But the vehicle that appeared was Dr. Calloway's familiar sedan, and the passenger he was bringing was clearly someone who needed help, rather than someone who posed a threat. Even from a distance, they could see that the person in the passenger seat was injured and exhausted. "Another arrival," Elara said, standing and preparing to provide whatever assistance might be needed. "The work continues." As Dr. Calloway's car pulled up to the farmhouse, Elara reflected on how naturally she had adapted to this new life. The woman who had once hidden from human contact now found herself eagerly greeting strangers who needed protection, people whose courage in seeking justice reminded her daily of the best aspects of human nature. The passenger, Dr. Calloway, helped. From his car was a young man, probably in his early 20s, the hollow-eyed look of someone who had seen things that would haunt him forever. His civilian clothes couldn't disguise the military bearing that suggested recent service, and the careful way he moved indicated injuries that were still healing. "This is David," Dr. Calloway said, as he assisted the young man toward the porch. "He has information about supply line corruption that's been funding unauthorized operations. He's been on the run for 3 weeks." Elara stepped forward to offer support, noting the mixture of fear and hope in David's eyes. It was an expression she had learned to recognize, the look of someone who had risked everything to do the right thing and was now trying to trust that there were still people in the world who would help rather than betray them. "You're safe here," she said, meaning it completely. "We'll make sure you get medical care, legal protection, and whatever else you need to tell your story." As they helped David into the house, Elara caught sight of movement in the wheat fields beyond her property. For a moment, her heart raced. With memories of that day 6 months earlier when she had discovered Zara hiding in the grain, but these figures were different. They were her neighbors. Members of the informal security network that had developed to protect the valley from unwanted intrusion. Wilhelm Steinhardt appeared at the edge of the field, his radio in hand, and his expression alert but not alarmed. He raised one hand in the all-clear signal they had developed, indicating that the area was secure and that David's arrival had not been followed or observed by potentially hostile forces. Martha Caldwell's voice came through the kitchen radio, using the coded language they had established for sensitive communications. "Delivery successful. No complications observed. Recommend standard protocols." The efficiency with which the community had mobilized to protect another refugee filled Elara with gratitude for the neighbors who would embrace this dangerous work despite the personal risks involved. They had all been transformed by their decision to protect truth-tellers, rather than pretend that the corruption being exposed was someone else's problem. As Dr. Calloway began examining David's injuries and Colonel Eve started the process of establishing secure communications with legal advocates, Elara prepared the guest room that had become a temporary home for people whose courage had made them targets. The room that had once belonged to Lydia now served a purpose that honored her memory in ways Elara could never have imagined. Her daughter's death had meaning because it was part of a larger struggle for justice, and that struggle continued through the work being done in this house, in this valley, by people who refused to let truth be buried or forgotten. Later that evening, as David slept under medical care and secure communications carried his testimony to investigators around the world, Elara stood in her kitchen, reviewing the messages that had accumulated throughout the day. Requests for sanctuary from 3 different continents, updates on legal proceedings involving previous refugees, intelligence about potential threats to other safe houses, coordination requirements for a complex operation that was helping reshape how justice was pursued in cases involving institutional corruption. The grandfather clock chimed midnight, marking the end of another day in a life she could never have imagined. When she was hiding from the world in grief and isolation, the woman who had once measured time by the emptiness between one lonely meal and the next now counted hours by the lives she might be able to save, the truth she might be able to protect, the justice she might be able to advance. Outside, the wheat fields rustled in the night wind, no longer hiding secrets, but growing sustenance for people who had sacrificed everything to ensure that truth could not be silenced. The farm that had been her sanctuary from pain had become a sanctuary for others seeking justice. And in that transformation, Elara had discovered that healing came not from avoiding the world's problems, but from dedicating yourself to solving them. As she prepared for bed in a house that now served a purpose greater than personal comfort, Elara thought about Lydia and the choice her daughter had made to protect innocent lives even when it cost her everything. That same choice was now being made by people around the world who found their way to Thornwick Valley, and by the community that had embraced the dangerous work of protecting them. The cycle of loss and renewal, of truth buried and truth revealed, of justice delayed but not ultimately denied, continued with each new arrival. Each new testimony, each new victory against the forces that preferred darkness to light. And in that continuation, the farm that had sheltered one girl had become a beacon for everyone who believed that some things were worth risking everything to protect. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new refugees, new opportunities to honor the memory of those who had died protecting the innocent. Tonight, as Elara settled into sleep in a house filled with purpose rather than emptiness, she knew that the healing she had found through helping others had transformed not just her own life, but the lives of everyone whose courage had brought them to her door seeking justice, protection, and the chance to ensure that truth would ultimately prevail over institutional corruption and systematic injustice.